So I didn't actually know that Solar Ash was a game in development until it came out. I sort of found out about it the same week that it released. I was somewhat of a fan of the developer's last game, which was Hyper Light Drifter. That was a game you and I reviewed together. You didn't finish that one, and I did. And I ended up sort of getting into the groove of it, even though it felt repetitive. And what's funny about this new game is it also feels like there's a kind of groove of game design that it falls into. And that can also be somewhat repetitive. I don't know if you feel the same way about it.
Yeah, it's kind of a vibes game and a little bit of a flow state game. It's very forgiving in a lot of like the mundane things, the combat. The combat isn't too challenging.
So it's not like you're stringing together combos like a Devil May Cry, where you can have branches off of each beginning point of each combo, and that becomes like how you adapt to different enemies. And this one, it's just like a series of 3 hits, and then you move forward, and maybe there's a little quick dash attack that you can do. And that's pretty much the whole game. So it's not like a combat-focused game in that way.
So in some ways, the game reminds me of a much, much more easily controlled version of a Jet Set Radio. You're kind of on rails, but you have to be precise within those constraints. Like, it's really about the skating, even though you don't literally have skates on. It's kind of this sci-fi version of skating, but it's
you're floating on cloud blobs,
right?
In essence.
So it kind of has like a sports game feel, like Tony Hawk or Jet Set Radio.
And the world itself is quite colorful. It has the same palette as Hyper Light Drifter in that it's like purples and greens and reds, and your character is flowing through the environment. And what's ironic about that is that you're supposed to be inside of a black hole. It's supposed to be like this dismal, like you cross the event horizon in order to save a civilization that has been sucked in and destroyed. And you find dead people here and there, but it's bright and enthusiastic looking, and it almost has this like this color palette of a Saturday morning cartoon, very thrilling, like DC Universe superheroes or something. And yet you're supposed to be in a very grim environment where everyone's dead and you're just trying to save them.
It reminds me of Hyper Light Drifter in that you feel kind of like you're coming into things not fully having the world explained to you, but it also maybe spends a lot more time than I would have liked explaining it anyway without actually answering a lot of questions. And the writing isn't its strong suit. It doesn't seem like a game where I want to talk all the time. Yeah.
Well, this is one of those games where I really would have wished, and this seems like a counterintuitive thing to want, but lack of voice acting probably would have done this game some service, right? Because then I get to put into the world myself whatever emotion is supposed to be elicited by what they're saying. And instead, the voices of these characters are forcing me to feel whatever it is that they want me to feel, and that feels somewhat constrained. That doesn't really grab you in the way that they would expect.
What is this place? Who are you?
I was someone once, but no longer. Now I am merely an echo.
And also with silence comes the chance for the art design and the world to actually have some degree of mystery to it. And because there's so much exposition, having all of that readily available makes the world feel way more compacted and far less freeform, which seems counter to the visuals. The visuals themselves are actually quite loose and cartoony and almost artistic in that way. Now, what did you think of the actual game design itself, like what you're doing in this game? Because I expected this game to be like a 3D Zelda, right? Just because, I mean, this is simplistic, but at the very start, you're placed in the central hub, and it looks like you have to go to these side areas, and each one seems like, oh, there's a mini goal in each of these areas. That must be like a puzzle room. Now, there is kind of puzzles in this game, but it's not the traditional puzzles that I would have expected. It seems more movement based, almost like a platformer.
I think the platforming can be very satisfying, but also really dissatisfying for kind of the same reason, which is that it's all momentum based. So as soon as you mess anything up, you have to wander back to the start of a kind of track that kind of breaks the flow of the other design emphasis, which is to just enjoy the environment and collect things and explore every nook and cranny.
Yeah, the fact that you can at any point hold, like on an Xbox controller, it's LB, and you just get all of the markers of where you need to go.
Right.
Remove some of the discovery that's available there. Now, there are all of these little red collectibles everywhere that you can just follow, and you know, those are like a currency that you can then use to upgrade your character. But what I've noticed is they didn't really lead to anything intriguing. Like, I followed a lot of the trails of each of those collectibles thinking like, oh man, I'm gonna find like some hidden puzzle room or something, and it just sort of circles you around, or it will just sort of take you like in a loop down, and maybe you'll find like a little tiny landmark here or there, but there's nothing particularly engaging in that space. So really the most engaging spaces are the ones where you're guided toward. So even though it's a hub-like semi-open world, it's actually quite linear, weirdly, because there's not really much to do outside of those main nodes that you're commanded to go to. Here's what I found as I got further along. By the second boss, I actually started to understand a little bit more why the puzzle design is the way that it is. It's a movement kind of puzzle, right? Where you're just trying to get from space to space to space as quickly as possible. It's almost like you're speed running from start to finish, and you need to hit these little markers along the way, and then you can stab the eyeball, and that's your big goal, right? And so when you do these big boss battles, it's the same kind of thing where you're riding on top of the boss, almost like Shadow of the Colossus style, and then you reach the endpoint. What was super fun is on the second boss, it felt like the movement was so haphazard, like things were spinning and I was being thrust into the air and I had to find wherever the next node was going to be. I noticed it felt like when I was speed running through that challenge, it was like playing a rhythm game.
Yeah.
And I started to notice that after that boss, like in that third area that you're able to go to, that as the challenges get harder in order for you to speed run through to the little eyeballs, it felt more and more like I'm just familiarizing myself with the controls button-wise in order to do them at a kind of rhythm so that I can make it in time. Right. Now that seems like a creative idea. Like that's something quite fun. Unfortunately though, because it reminds me of a rhythm-like experience, anything that breaks that flow is quite annoying.
Right.
And the things that the little eyeballs that you have to reach, they're all on top of a sticky substance. And it's very easy to get your foot stuck in those as you're trying to cross from each one to the next. It both feels like a rhythm game, and it also feels like a game that is going out of its way to stop you feeling smooth and melodic and rhythmic in your own pace. So one thing that I noticed about the quest design, you know, on top of the game just telling you where to go, it also feels like the challenge of getting there is not so much the actual little rhythm challenge at the end of needing to hit the eyeball. It's really figuring out how do I even start that little rhythm challenge. Because in the second area of the game, there's these tall skyscraper-like buildings. And I actually got lost in that area, which I don't know how you feel about getting lost, but it's kind of irritating to not really understand how to get from point A to B, even though you know where point B is. And that seems to be the quest design of the game.
Right, so you're kind of pixel hunting or just sort of wandering around until you eventually find exactly what you need to do. The funny thing about a game where you have to aimlessly look around for so long is that it can feel like the game just isn't working. Like there's this concern in the back of your mind that the actual game code might not have triggered correctly, and you might actually not have a means of going forward. So there's this limbo that you get into. It feels like the story and the immersion has sort of gone on pause, and you're wondering, am I even making progress now?
Yeah, and one of the most frustrating things that can happen in this case is sometimes I would look at the environment. I would sort of analyze, okay, that's where I want to go. I can see a vague trail of how to get there. I would start following that trail, and I would think I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to do because I'm finding little red collectibles here and there. And then I would reach a little corner where I'm right next to where I need to go, and I just can't jump past that little corner. Right. And it just feels like, okay, I have to now go back and find a whole separate trail. But like, realistically, I am so close. Feels almost like you're being teased perpetually, and then you're following through. You know, you're doing exactly what you seem to believe is expected of you, and it becomes almost a waste of time. And so even though the game is linear, it has that terrible feeling that some open world games can give, where you're just thinking, what am I doing?
Is this how you want to spend your time?
Yeah. And then of course, because that seems to be the game's forte, is sort of this rhythmic, like here, like do these speedrun puzzles. If you're not a fan of that kind of puzzle, I don't know that the game's going to be very satisfying down the line. Like obviously the environments get a little crazier and crazier as you go. Like the third area starts to get far more expansive, and the Colossus is quite a bit larger. But it's just sort of exaggerating elements that you're already familiar with. And that was a problem that Hyper Light Drifter had too. Where it's sort of taking like from the first 20 or so minutes, you kind of knew what you were getting into. And then as you kept going and going, it's sort of like, okay, it's just a more extreme version of that. And so, you know, if you want the combat to get deeper, it doesn't seem like that really expands. If you want the rhythm thing to get more puzzly in such a way where you really hit the bend, you're thinking it doesn't seem like it's pushing in that direction. It's more pushing your button pressing skills as it goes along. The bulk of the game being exploration makes it so that you're always chasing after that next carrot on the stick, which is that big final boss battle at the end of each area. And because that's the carrot on the stick, that becomes the peak of the experience, the thing that you're anticipating the most and is potentially the most satisfying. Now, the thing that makes it feel rhythmic to me when I'm doing those boss battles is it feels like, okay, because I have to dash with RT, I have to hold LT to run, I have to tap X to attack, and I have to press RB to zoom in. That's essentially a rhythmic combination of button presses. And I'm doing all of that in a kind of rhythm with each boss. And it's just like more complex versions of that. And so you're just doing variations of that. And so, yes, of course, that's satisfying in the way that like doing a Guitar Hero battle. I don't know if anyone knows what Guitar Hero is anymore, but that used to be the big rhythm game, right? Or a Rock Band. It feels like that where it's like, oh, cool, I did it. But just like Rock Band and Guitar Hero, you also eventually get better at the song, not because you improve your skills, but because you've done the song so many times that you get good. So you'll keep dying at the boss and then you'll just memorize it and then do it. And yes, of course, that's satisfying. That's like an old school platformer style of like you just get used to where the obstacles are. But when you can predict that, that becomes far less satisfying.